Hello everyone, Gizmo here. Hope you're having a wonderful day. And before we get into the video today, I would just like to let you know that Sqaure Enix have tweeted about the opportunity to test out a new mobile game. And although they don't specify which game it is, you can apply now on their website. And once you register your interest, look out for an email granting you access to the beta. Just be aware, however, that there is a privacy policy with the private beta and terms and conditions attached. My guess is, based on their recent activity regarding mobile titles, that this will either be Kingdom Hearts Missing Link or Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis. If you're interested and happen to stumble across this video, I have left a link down below in the description. And I hope that Sqaure Enix select you. And with that, let's get into today's video. Now, I'm probably going to be bringing to you what seems like a hot take, and that is that Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise is indeed a masterpiece. Yes, you heard that right. Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise is a masterpiece.
Bullshit.
Just please hear me out. Because I'll be honest, when the game was first announced, I honestly didn't care for it at all. I was too swept with the memes of chaos that spawned from the excessive use of the word
Chaos.
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 Chaos. Chaos.
Chaos. Chaos. Chaos. That's all I know.
And honestly, I felt like this was just going to be another loose remake. I was also very apprehensive when Sqaure Enix advertised this game as a spin-off Final Fantasy title, because it deviated so far from traditional Final Fantasy gameplay. Although they kind of did this already with Final Fantasy 15 being action-based instead of the regular turn-based or ATB gauge. But I digress. Since, well, this takes things a step further with gameplay, similar to that of Nier, which is also developed by the same company that made Stranger of Paradise, Team Ninja. And with all this information about the game prior to its release, I was just feeling very apprehensive and not knowing whether I would even enjoy this game or not, even if the story turned out to be good. And for me, that all changed when I first played the demo of Stranger of Paradise, because although the demo only gives you around about 3 or 4 different levels, after defeating Captain Bikke, I was hooked. Not only did I enjoy the gameplay itself, although action, it still maintained a level of strategy that felt true to Final Fantasy. I found myself working with every monster's weakness in order to best it in combat, and unlike most Final Fantasy games, I just felt like the gameplay was testing me as a player in a way I haven't been challenged in a very, very long time. One false move and honestly, you can be in danger.
I'm in danger!
If not dead. But it wasn't only the gameplay itself that I enjoyed, because as I played, I realised that the game was using locations from the original Final Fantasy and presenting them in a fresh new light. Which not only made the game demo feel fresh and enjoyable, but still encompassed what made these areas feel like they came straight out of the world from Final Fantasy 1. I was expecting a straight up remake of the original Final Fantasy before I played, and now I was thinking that this was just a pure reimagining of the world of Final Fantasy 1. Little did I know I was only half right, and that Stranger of Paradise could offer me so much more being a fan of the franchise. First, I just want to talk about the world in Stranger of Paradise, more the aesthetic, because as I said before, each area in the world is essentially a recreation of an area from the original Final Fantasy. And you go to past locations like the Chaos Shrine, Cornelia, the Earth Cavern, and others, but what I found amazing, and warning, because this may be a little bit of a spoiler, but lore-wise, for Stranger of Paradise, each area is actually inspired by another location from one of the other mainline series of games. And I was absolutely in love with learning this, because somehow not only did the level design complement both the original Final Fantasy, as it maintained the look of the original but with updated graphics, in 4K essentially, but it perfectly gave homage to the other games in the series as well, that it took inspiration from in the first place. Even in loading screens, you can read one of many reports giving details about the locations themselves, like the Fire Cavern being documented as inspiration for the Fire Cavern in Dimension 8. And if you've played Final Fantasy 8, this is where you take your seed trial as Sqaure to get E3 as a GF. And I was seriously caught by surprise from this, just to learn this little bit of lore. But was this really enough to make Stranger of Paradise a masterpiece in my eyes? Well, no, not at all. But it started to make one thing clear. Stranger of Paradise was released to celebrate the 35th anniversary of Final Fantasy. Because at its core, Stranger of Paradise is a celebration of everything that makes Final Fantasy as a franchise, even if it does use the original Final Fantasy game as its source for most of its inspiration. And this isn't just shown through the level design either, as even the music and soundtrack of the game itself is deliberately chosen based on the area or dimension that the location is from. And I get it, Sqaure Enix always has a fantastic soundtrack, but I have never been as amazed as being able to pick out just which area belonged to which Final Fantasy just based on the music alone. And the most notable examples of these, for me, was the forest area having a soundtrack that immediately clicked as the Sunleft Waterscape from Final Fantasy 13 and the Macro Reactor music from Final Fantasy 7 inside the water shrine when you go to fight the Kraken. And whilst the enemies are literally all the iconic enemies from the original Final Fantasy, the fact that Stranger of Paradise can even hit nostalgia and aesthetics from all Final Fantasy games in the franchise with level layout, soundtracks, is astonishing to me and really just highlights how much of a love letter Stranger of Paradise really is to the mainline Final Fantasy franchise.
Warning, chaos infection. Warning, chaos infection.
So if you want to avoid spoilers, click off the video now, go play the game first. And for those of you that are still here, let's dive into the story of Stranger of Paradise and why I feel it should be considered as a mainline title. I mean, the story itself starts off in what seems to be a complete retelling of the original Final Fantasy, with the whole setup of the Warriors of Light, who have crystals that have come to save the world from darkness. However, the game itself throws a curveball from the get-go, as instead of the original 4, you only have 3 Warriors of Light. As I first played, I was kind of taken aback, but just chalked it down to the gameplay revolving around a 3-man party, due to the genre of game that this is. Fast forward to even the end of the first level, where you are confronted by some familiar armour, the armour of Garland from the original game. And the entire fight, I was so hyped that I could just get the opportunity to fight Garland in a way that made him feel like a force to be reckoned with. And not just a quick, easy tutorial boss this time around. He actually took skill to beat, in my opinion. And plus, this is the first proper fight with him in 3D graphics outside of anything that wasn't just Dissidia. And upon defeating him, only to be met with the realization that this wasn't Garland at all. Instead, this was just a girl who wanted to be imbued with the power of chaos. At this point, it's worth mentioning that this is where I felt like my initial thoughts had been wrong. This isn't a remake at all. It's just a reimagining of the original Final Fantasy told in 2022. But fast forward to the fight with Tiamat and the revelation that you receive a 5th party member, Sophia, who reveals that she is Tiamat. I started to be drawn into the game even more as Stranger of Paradise completely started to flip the script of the original Final Fantasy, given that Sophia also has a 5th crystal. It was here that I was really struggling to place where exactly Stranger of Paradise would fit within the Final Fantasy franchise. Because although it has direct ties with Final Fantasy 1's story, I couldn't really call it a remake or even a reimagining at this point, since it heavily tied itself to recreate the original world, even though it did use all of its boss fights. It somehow fits somewhere in the middle between a remake and a reimagining. Even the technology in the game is more fit to the future, given that hologram projections and things are present despite the original feeling like it belonged in the medieval fantasy era. It wasn't really until near the end of the game, after having defeated all the fiends, that everything started to click. And I don't know if this was just me slow to the uptake, or if anyone else that played this game also felt this. Let me know in the comments. But after you learn the revelation, every cycle you're brought into the world, your main protagonist, Jack, had always lost his memories. And I was starting to piece together the prospect of what this game could actually be. A prequel to the original Final Fantasy. But still, even if that were the case, how does everything make sense? Fast forward to the end of the game, where it's revealed your party members and Astos, who was literally a side character in the original. They really expand his story in this, which is really cool. Were there to assist the main protagonist Jack to becoming Chaos. And that's when everything hit me. Every single detail of the game previously just began to add up. Like Jack telling Sarah his name.
My name's Jack Garland.
I honestly just felt this name was just used in homage to the original character Garland and was little more than just an Easter egg. And even when Jack shouts,
I'll crush you!
During that Garland fight, I had just chalked it up to be a homage because at that point, that's all Stranger of Paradise is, right? It's just a homage to the original game. Well, yes, but it's also so much more. Because remember how I said all your party members want you to become Chaos? Well, as I said before, Sophia becomes Tiamat. And there were 4 fiends. 4 party members. Oh my god. All the pieces were beginning to line up. But hang on, there's still some discrepancies here. Because the technology still just seems way too futuristic. And whilst the original was a repeated time cycle, I still just had a hard time accepting how all this could just possibly fit together. Well, just before the final fight with Darkness, you literally get to destroy the time crystal that allows Jack the ability to travel back to the old world. Yeah, that's right, the original Final Fantasy I world. And it was just the final scene when the Warriors of Light actually confronted Garland that it just solidified what Stranger of Paradise was. And for me, this is why Stranger of Paradise is a masterpiece, because throughout the entire game, not only was I being treated to the biggest love letter to the entire Final Fantasy franchise, but the game itself just presented itself as something so familiar, yet could hide so much about itself, despite leaving clues left and right. It's not even just the Easter eggs, but the game's freaking title itself is telling you on the box what this game is. Final Fantasy Origin Stranger of Paradise. But honestly, from everything from the story to the level design and the music, Stranger of Paradise just subverted all of my expectations throughout the entire game in the best ways possible. And it's been a long time since a game has given me such joy upon completing it. This being essentially the origin story to Garland himself and a canon-worthy Final Fantasy I prequel is definitely worthy of being a mainline Final Fantasy franchise in of itself, especially when you consider it somehow links every Final Fantasy game together, despite them all having separate stories. Absolute masterpiece. That was my take of Stranger of Paradise. Now, do you think Stranger of Paradise is worthy of being called a masterpiece? Or do you think that this is all just a massive hot take? And what mobile game do you think Sqaure Enix are releasing as the beta test? Please let me know down in the comments. I'll be more than interested to hear your feedback. And like and subscribe if you like this content. I hope you continue to have a really good day. And I'll see you around.